and I think it does need to be addressed. But I think what also needs to be addressed is the separation between state institutions and the overall structures of power in Haitian society, power and wealth. So who controls the state, right? The state is not just, the government is not just there in the air. There are social forces that can influence the government and others that don't have any power to influence the government. So I think these are also serious considerations, and the fragile state concept doesn't really address these kinds of issues. It doesn't speak to those. In some, there's a lack of attention to separating state institutions from oligarchic or patrimonial control that just doesn't get addressed. On a related note, the state fragility concept has been accompanied by a really sharp focus on security. So before the state fragility, before we started talking about fragile states, we weren't as focused on security and development and so on. If you look at Canada's interventions in Haiti in the 1990s, for instance, right, which would have been from, let's say, 1994 to 2000, we were very much involved in Haiti at that time as well. The suggestion in the policy community that poor countries are more likely to conflict than wealthy countries, so you see more conflict in poor countries, and that fragile states pose a threat to Canadian security and values because of that, this hadn't really developed into a solid policy consensus yet among policymakers. This whole belief that you know, these fragile states are a threat to international security and to therefore our security as Canadians. And it was the release of the former Bush administration's national security strategy in 2002, which declared, and this is a quote, that America is now threatened less by conquering states than by failing ones, unquote. So that statement, which came out in 2002, had an enormous influence on policymakers in all OECD countries, but in Canada in particular. I won't get into that, but Canada and the US are very, very close, very important. The US is our most important partner. So when they talk about security and certain concepts, we tend to also talk about those concepts. So that's at the moment that these kind of fragile states begin to be viewed as a threat to Western states, to Western security. Now what's interesting, and the reason I'm going to make this link is, what's interesting is that scholars who actually write on processes of state formation or state building and so on, their work, if they look at the history of how states have emerged through history and become consolidated, they talk about processes of uncontrolled, non-democratic, and even bloody violence. In other words, other states, including their own states, the states in Europe historically, when they went through the process of forming the state, there was a lot of chaos, okay? These scholars that write about these issues note that it took widespread social mobilization and protest, very broad social protest, in order to give people citizenship who were not included within the polity, right? In short, many historical studies have shown that state formation and democratization, the process of democratization, are actually chaotic processes. And they often involve armed struggle, and they've often involved economic conflicts, and they've often involved ideological zeal. That's what history has shown us, okay? Now, in light of this, we might well ask ourselves whether it's somewhat problematical, a little bit of a problem, to be employing a model of democracy building that privileges stability, while promoting at the same time processes of democratization and state formation that have historically been conflictual, okay? And a closely related question in my work that I've been thinking about would be, how does this kind of, what we say in English, keeping the lid on conflict, making sure conflict doesn't bubble up, how does this keeping the lid on approach that Western donors use when kind of thinking about Haiti and other fragile states, how does it inform the type of democracy that emerges then? And what I mean by that is, whose interests will governance ultimately serve if social struggles in those countries are discouraged from being played out? Okay? So my line of argument in other places that I've given this talk has encountered reservations and objections, especially among those who have worked so hard for establishing stability in Haiti. And I understand that. My purpose in highlighting these points is not to suggest in any way that social chaos is a good thing. I don't believe that. I don't deny the very considerable value of security. Like international donors, I believe that Haitians deserve to live in peace. And I feel they deserve to have a secure life. They deserve to experience security in their streets and in their homes. That's not what my points are getting to. Rather, my aim is to persuade international donors like Canada, who are engaged in democracy building, who are engaged in state building, to recognize that the histories of their own states diverge considerably from the technocratic, gradualistic conception of democratization that underlies their programs today. That this is, you can go into a ministry and train people and so on and so forth. It denies the deep political conflict that is bubbling underneath the democratization process. Now, I also want to make sure, I don't want to suggest to you, because some of you here are students, that all societies pass through similar stages or phases, and because there was disturbance and violence and conflict in European countries when they went through democratization, and even the United States. What was the civil rights movement, right? I mean, blacks in the United States did not gain citizenship because somebody came in from outside and said, you know what? You in the southern states, you should let those black people vote. And that's going to work, right? They had to fight to get that right. And it was ugly, and it was in the streets, and people were killed. And people died for that right. So all I'm saying is that it's not as technocratic as we might think it is. And I don't want to suggest that because this happened in the United States or it happened in Europe, that it's necessarily going to happen, it needs to happen in Haiti. I'm not suggesting that. I do believe that particular colonial legacies and the way various countries have been inserted in the global economy generate very different state building trajectories in the periphery, in the global south. That each country will have its own process of democratization. It will be different. Rather, my point is that democratization is about the redistribution of power. That's what it is about fundamentally. The rest, the elections, is how we do this. But what we're really talking about is doing it, is redistributing power. And rarely do those in power give it up willingly and without animosity. Okay? So that's what my point is. Now, I've argued elsewhere in other writings that Canada needs to both question and acknowledge the political consequences of an approach that assigns so much primacy to stability and to order. Okay? And I think that this value springs from our security-focused, fragile state concept. And I think that a lot of the reason we focus on order and so on. Now, as I said before, a concern for order is important, and Canada, and I have said this many times before, Canada's support for the stabilization efforts in Haiti between 2004 and 2006, that was critical, supporting stability and security in Haiti at that time, and that's what allowed a fair electoral process to take place. And Professor Castor mentioned that the MINUSTA's support, Canada didn't have forces in the MINUSTA, but we were involved in other ways with the mission, that was very important. What I'm saying is that overvaluing stability and order in future years could preclude or could prevent the possibility of genuine democratic empowerment for the popular classes in Haiti. as well as the possibility of redressing their grievances and addressing their long-term interests.